So, back during our discussion of the generational aspect of the climate crisis, I drew attention to the fact that houses have been slowly supersizing during my lifetime. As I noted, 1950, shortly before I was born, the average size of an American house was just under 1,000 square feet. Today, the average size is over 2,500 square feet, more than 2.5 times larger, even though American families are now considerably smaller. And, of course, as with so many things American, bigger is often perceived as better. Hence, if you can afford it, the ideal home is often much larger. 1 in 5 new U.S. houses is now, in fact, over 3,000 square feet, and 1 in 10 is a McMansion at over 4,000 square feet. In contrast, a traditional Japanese home, which housed families of 4 or more, was 1/10 that size at 400 square feet. So, the ever-reliable Union of Concerned Scientists notes that 17% of the average American's carbon footprint comes from heating and cooling our homes. But in addition, 15% comes from other energy-related uses in the home, such as lighting and housing. Suffice it to say that, at approximately a third when combined, 32% to be exact, so a large chunk of the American climate footprint comes from our homes. Indeed, in terms of our personal climate footprints, only transportation, and that's chiefly cars and flying at 28%, and our relentless acquisition of stuff, 26%, rival our houses and their energy use as climate offenders. Though, let's be clear, they both fall short of houses. Incidentally, as transportation, housing, and stuff, in that order, are responsible for 86% of our personal carbon footprints, it clearly points to where we need to personally direct our attention if we hope to mitigate the climate crisis. The remaining 14%, 16%, comes from food. Hence, while what we eat is certainly important, I would argue it's very important. Nonetheless, transportation, housing, and stuff are on average each twice as important. Part of the problem with houses, which is not reflected in that 32% from the Union of Concerned Scientists, is the embedded cost of carbon in our homes. In other words, a ton of CO2 or equivalent gases is released when a house is built. Actually, about 80 metric tons are released to build a typical house. This is the same problem that we encountered with the manufacture of a car. However, with a house, the situation is better, as they generally last far longer than the 11 years of an average car. Even if a house lasted just 80 years, which would be a relatively short lifespan for a home, and had just 2 occupants, that would work out to 1/2 metric ton of CO2 a year per person. Of course, that would still be 1/4 of each of the occupants' total annual carbon footprint, but it's still far better than the embedded carbon in a car, which is 4 times as much when spread out over its usable lifetime. So, keeping in mind that we still have to, nonetheless, contend with the energy provided for heating that house, for cooling, for appliances like refrigerators, washers, dryers, and all that, that takes 32% of the average American's carbon allotment. The problem here is that, as Americans expend over 16 metric tons of CO2 or equivalent on average, 32% of this works out to 5 metric tons per person. This jumps even more if we add in embedded carbon. Hence, the average American is expending over 2.5 times their total annual carbon allotment for their homes. And of course, this leaves nothing for food, clothing, transportation, and all the stuff that Americans love to acquire to fill our homes. So what's to be done? How exactly do we go about reducing this? As with many issues related to the climate crisis, it is useful to approach this as a cultural problem. Hence, while I definitely support actions like increasing home insulation and putting photovoltaic solar cells on our roofs, and in fact, my wife and I did both of those things for our little Santa Barbara house, this is not enough. So, what then is to be done? It's simple enough. Move to a micro apartment or certain co-housing communities, as this can greatly reduce your climate footprint. As I noted in a previous lecture, the good news for both transportation and housing is there's a simple way to approach both of them. Move to a city. City living can mean dramatically less car use. In Manhattan, for example, only 1 in 5 people commute to work by car, and generally smaller and more efficient housing. Many cities have made major commitments, therefore, to mass transportation and bicycle use, as well as micro apartments. Consequently, I want to focus on cities. A majority, 55% of human beings on the planet, planet now live in cities. By 2050, that number is expected to jump to over 2/3 or more. In order to take up cities and city life, I want to again consider Henry David Thoreau and his life on the shores of Walden Pond. This may seem to be an odd move, as Thoreau is probably best remembered for the 2 years of his life that he spent living on the rustic shores of Walden Pond, which was, as far as he was concerned, as far from city life as possible, while still being pretty close to his hometown. However, as I suggested in the lecture on Walden, his important legacy for the 21st century is, at least as far as I'm concerned, that he took a long, hard look at his life with an eye to reducing everything unnecessary. In this sense, it is less important where he did what he did than the fact that he took up this personal reductionist project. So here is something to ponder. What would Thoreau's Walden experiment had been like had it not been conducted in a semi-wilderness setting, but an urban one instead? Sure, his profound aesthetic appreciation of the scene would of course be different. But in wholly practical terms, what would such a lifestyle be like? In other words, what would a life of urban rather than wilderness simplicity be like? Given our topic today, I'm primarily thinking of housing here. In a variety of different places, in a range of different ways, people are not only asking this question, but taking up new lifestyles in reply. What's more, these are not isolated and quirky, but in many instances are mainstream efforts that are offered as models for us all with respect to housing. For example, in 2012, spearheaded by then Michael Bloomberg, New York City launched its Adapt NYC pilot housing program to encourage micro apartments by fostering a competition for real estate developers. In 2013, the winning design was announced, which consisted of a modular building with 55 units with floor plans between 250 and 370 square feet. Although this might seem a little large when compared to Thoreau's cabin, keep in mind that these units have bathrooms and full kitchens, which Thoreau didn't. Even so, as the larger apartments can be home to a couple at 185 square feet per person, these units are surprisingly close to Thoreau's ideal size for domestic simplicity, which was 150 square feet. New York is not alone as a testbed for this movement, as Boston, San Francisco, and an exciting range of other cities are adapting zoning for apartments as small as 220 square feet each. In many respects, the Adapt NYC program and similar projects are squarely in Thoreau's rugged individualist tradition, which is a thoroughly American phenomenon. What I mean by that is Thoreau lived alone, which is exactly how many Americans, most Americans live, either alone or with their immediate family, and by that I mean either with their parents or children. Consequently, each of our houses has a kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room, and so forth. But must it be that way? Co-housing, which is less common in the U.S. than in Europe, or at least in a modern sense, it began around 50 years ago. Co-housing challenges this individualist tradition. In a co-housing community, individuals and communities can live in smaller housing because they share services and amenities with others in their community. For example, members of the community often share meals 4 or more times a week, which are cooked in a community kitchen. Incidentally, the documentary Happy has a very interesting segment on co-housing in Denmark. Even if you don't watch the whole film, someone was kind enough to upload this particular segment to YouTube. It's worth pausing to consider this global movement towards cities as a form of environmental activism, as it can be seen as representative of a new kind of environmental thinking, which is profoundly different from what Thoreau advocated. However, this approach does resemble Thoreau's in one important respect, as an emerging group of environmentalists is increasingly prompted to direct and personal action rather than being content with merely speculating on our planet's future from the sidelines. Like Thoreau, they are engaged in a gritty experiment with real-life environmental consequences. They are not, however, as with the Back to Nature movement of their parents and grandparents, following Thoreau's lead and retreating to the last scraps of American wilderness or expending a disproportionate amount of energy on its defense. To the contrary, many are going in the opposite direction that we have been discussing by moving to a different sort of land, which many abandoned decades ago, such as cities. For well over a decade now, a new wave of environmental activists has literally been greening cities. New York City's High Line and Paris's Promenade Plantée Both greenways, fashioned from abandoned railways, have become icons of this movement, as too have rooftop gardens, backyard chicken coops, and vertical farms. These activists are not leaving the city for nature. They're bringing nature to the city, as the blended rural-urban lifestyle growing there is impacting a broad range of everyday practices. This movement is not limited to cities, but increasingly including suburbs as well, where lawns are being replaced by vegetable gardens and municipal ordinances are being rewritten to allow livestock, like goats and sheep, to graze among swimming pools and tennis courts. Although the growth of urban and suburban farming may seem trivial, even quirky and amusing, in some sense this movement overturns 5,000 years of thinking. Beginning with the very first works of Western literature, country and city, and by extension nature and culture, have been repeatedly imagined as not only mutually exclusive, but in opposition. In recent centuries, the country has nearly always been preferred, the city eschewed. This attitude was alive and well in Thoreau, who, distressed by the growth of urban and industrial modernity, fled to what he imagined to be its opposite, the closest thing to nature that he could find. Now, however, a new group of environmental activists is increasingly shifting its attention from nature untouched by culture, such as the wilderness of national parks and tropical rainforests, which preoccupied many environmental activists throughout the 20th century, sometimes to the exclusion of nearly everything else. But rather, they're looking to a vision, a culture infused with nature, the merging of those two ancient opposites, country and city. Cities, among the most developed of all places that human beings inhabit, are becoming test beds for the idea that culture can be far more natural than we ever imagined. Thanks to works by Edward Glaser, David Owen, and others, the idea of a green metropolis, which is Owen's phrase, no longer sounds like a contradiction. The formidable challenges to green cities even further, which as Glaser and Owen argue, are already in many respects far more environmentally benign than suburbs and even most rural locales. Although at first glance counterintuitive, they compellingly argue that life in Manhattan is far greener than in Wyoming in a variety of ways. The notion that cities can be green and natural may seem counterintuitive, debatable, or even just plain wrong. It certainly may have seemed so to earlier activists like Earth First founder Dave Foreman, who 3 decades ago boldly declared that civilization inescapably creates a rift between human beings and nature. His solution, which was among the most radical offered by his generation of activists, was to call for the protection of wilderness by nearly any means necessary, even if it required acts of eco-sabotage. By contrast, this new wave of activists is focused on areas already developed and inhabited by human beings, which cover far more of the Earth's surface than the remaining remnants of wilderness. If we hope to save the planet, which is now largely covered by cities, suburbs, farms, factories, and all sorts of other human works and projects, we need to turn our attention and our energies to these places. This shift in focus reveals just how much environmental activism is changing. Eco-sabotage, and of course more benign tactics employed by moderate back-to-nature environmentalists, which were aimed at thwarting and checking encroachment into wilderness, is being supplanted, replaced by eco-nurturing of areas that we already have developed and inhabit, like cities. So, does this mean that we all need to live in cities? No, of course not. However, we really need to rethink the image of cities. My generation, following Thoreau's lead, often saw cities as environmental nightmares and instead fled for the suburbs. This created a problem, a big one, as I noted in my most recent book, which is on writing a new environmental era and moving forward to nature. If a large swath of the population took Thoreau's lead and moved away from cities and out to rural locales, it would, with absolutely no doubt, be an environmental disaster of unprecedented proportions. So why am I so sure? Because it actually happened and was. It began in Thoreau's era in the U.S., as motivated by like-minded individuals thinking like Thoreau, acting on the same back-to-nature impulse that gave birth to his Walden experiment. In a sense, it became the largest and, to my mind, most regrettable cultural movement of the 20th century. Hundreds of millions of people across the globe fled cities for the dream of simpler rural lives. They ended up far short of that goal, not in rural areas, but in suburbia. At first, in Thoreau's era, they left in trains. A century later, the process sped up dramatically as automobiles became the preferred way to get out of the city and then around in the suburbs. It soon became an environmental disaster on a global scale. In contrast, today human beings by the billions are moving back to urban areas. It may well be the greatest cultural movement of the 21st century. I'm curious to hear what you think about all this, about living in micro-apartments, co-housing communities, and cities, and their regreening. Although it may sound a little strange on first hearing, each of these decisions can be a form of climate activism, a very effective form of climate activism.